Hello and welcome to this very special show here on CNBC TV 18, coming to you from the Taj Palace Hotel in New Delhi. And with me today is Dr. Hans Paul, the Global Chairman of Boston Consulting Group.
Hello, Ron.
Thank you. Great to have you on our show, Hans Paul. Let's start a little bit about the global economy, because 2016 has started off on a rather tempestuous note. You've seen the global markets. The oil prices are hovering around the $30 mark. People are now beginning to say $20, as Goldman Sachs has predicted about a year ago, is not that off the mark. There seems to be this overall gloom. Is this pessimism justified?
Well, of course, whenever things are slowing down or changing, people start to become negative. But actually, we have been seeing relatively modest growth rates for quite a while. This is what we expected from China. And then also, I think in the course of that, for quite a number of countries, depending on commodities. And I think in the developed world, Europe, Asia, or Japan, I should say, clearly growth rates will be relatively modest because of the sheer demographic development. So I think we should not be surprised the developments are not as negative as we make them. We just have to adjust our expectations.
So you're saying it's not that negative, but we need to adjust our expectations. In fact, Christine Lagarde had also talked once that how the world needs to get used to this low growth regime. So then that is here to stay and everyone must accept it.
Well, let's say not low growth, but lower growth regime. I mean, when we think about the growth rates before the financial crisis in the developed world, these were growth rates which were not sustainable because they were debt-fueled to a massive extent. There was enormous exuberance and exaggerations, and I think we just need to make sure that when we are going back to a more normal regime, growth rates will also be somewhat lower.
Right. What do economies then do? I mean, clearly, the case of an emerging market is very different from the more developed world. So, in case of from where you come from, countries like Germany, countries like Spain, how is Europe dealing with this in terms of getting used to this lower growth regime?
Well, I mean, in Europe, as I said, because of the demographics, we need to get used to growth rates of 1–1.5%, this will be the norm rather than the exception. And I think that's perfectly fine as long as we do not always feel that there should be a lot more. And how do we create this? By more debt financing, by consumption that is being debt fueled. I think we need to be realistic. We need to be also reform Europe, labor markets. Regulations are creating enormous burden for businesses, for people in general, and we need to make adjustments. We also need to get used to working longer. So pension age needs to be extended. We need to make sure that we refine and reform the healthcare systems. We need to make sure that we invest more in schooling, in infrastructure in general. But above all, we need to make sure that people can really find jobs again, and not by creating more bureaucracy, more regulations, tightening labor markets, but by opening up. And everybody talks about this, but then at the same time, given that governments are more reluctant to bring in reforms, they expect the central bank to flood the market with liquidity.
Do you agree? How do you look upon the monetary policies? Because, in India, our governor has been very, very critical. He calls them the unconventional monetary policies, and it's debatable whether it serves its desired purpose or not.
But I must admit, I'm a true German. As a true German, we feel that actually what the central bank is doing in Europe is excessive and will not serve any purpose. We have we don't have any inflation. There's no actually lack of liquidity in the markets. Of course, what the European Central Bank wants is to keep interest rates very low so that debt to GDP ratios are not rising. And they also want to depreciate the euro so that for many of the southern European countries it becomes easier to export. But in terms of will that really stimulate the economies? Probably not.
So those monetary policies are aimed at more at weakening their domestic currency to become export competitive rather than actually, to create liquidity.
Weakening the euro, yes.
Right, right.
Like the Japanese have done before, and some others have done it before.
In fact, Bank of Japan very recently now cut their interest rates to below, below minus 0.25%. Tell me a little bit also in terms of what the U.S. Fed may do, because they hiked their interest rates for the first time in over in almost a decade, and since then there's been a lot of turmoil. Do you think that's going to sort of force the U.S. Fed to be a little more hesitant next time round?
Well, first of all, I think we've seen a very, very small increase, and getting back to normal interest rates will take a long, long time. So I think the Fed is doing something very sensible, trying to really go back to somewhat more normal levels, but at a very, very measured pace. So if we see 2, 3 further increases this year, that will be fine, but we will still be only around 1%. That's a very, very low rate still.
Right, right. No, because earlier the expectations were that she would at least do 4 rate hikes in 2016. So given what has happened, and the fact that in her statement recently also she said that she will take into account the global turmoil. So keeping that in mind, do you think she'll be far more cautious, and those 3 to 4 rate hikes that were expected before her first rate hike may not come through?
Well, it could be 2, it could be 3, who knows? I think they don't know themselves, because they also don't know how things will play out in the course of the year.
Right.
And I think, but what they are trying to do is very sensible, trying to get back to normal interest rates. I mean, interest rates of 0 for a long, long time leads to enormous distortions. And so I think we need to find ways of going back to a more normal interest rate regime.
Right. Tell me a little bit of how you read the Chinese economy, because that has been the big talking point. A large part of the reason for the global turmoil, people say, it's because of what's happening in China. What's your reading? You know the economy very well. How do you see it from the outside?
I mean, we've seen a tremendous development in China over the last 25 years, something that nobody expected. I've been studying the Chinese and the Indian economic development since the early 70s as a student, because I felt very passionate about that. And nobody at that time, in his or her right mind, thought that China and India would develop that well in a lifetime. So it's a fantastic achievement. Now, the old model, investment-fueled economy has come to certain limits, and the Chinese government has started the transition.
Right.
And it's a transition that will take 10 years or more. And it will not be without pain. And so we are seeing growth rates coming down from 11% or even more down to 7% to 6%, maybe 5% at some stage. That's perfectly fine. And I think we should get used to that. And we still see, that the absolute amount of growth in China in 2015 was around 600, 700 billion dollars. That's a huge economy. That's much more than any other country has added to the global GDP. So an outstanding performance, but of course it's less than what was in the past, and it's perfectly fine.
So Europe, where we're going to see barely any growth, China, slower growth, and these are things that we must get used to.
Yes.
Then where will the growth come from?
I mean, it's still significant growth. If the world grows at 3%, 3.5%, that's still a significant achievement. Now, of course, we've seen in some countries, depending on commodities, there is no growth or even negative growth. If you think of Brazil, if you think of Russia, if you think of some of the oil countries or African countries. And I think it also, is a very good reminder to everybody to really diversify their economy and not be depending on one big drug, meaning commodities.
All right, let's take our first break on this, and on the other side, we're going to talk with Dr. Hans Paul, what he thinks about India, and of course, Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Stay tuned.